Welcome back to Retro Laws. Today, we're going inside the dark, forgotten world of Baroque, released in 1998. It is a game that does not care about your comfort. It wanted to trap you inside a living nightmare that never truly ends. Chapter 1: The Incineration of Reality. The 90s was a golden age for the survival horror genre. Players were used to fighting zombies in mansions and running from monsters in foggy towns. Most of these games followed a very clean, predictable structure. You found keys, you solved puzzles, and you saved the day. But in the middle of this gaming boom, a Japanese developer named Sting released something entirely alien. They created a game that felt less like a fun adventure and more like a fever dream. That game was Baroque, and it first arrived on the Sega Saturn. It did not try to ease players into its world with an exciting opening movie. Instead, it threw you directly into the ashes of a dead civilization. The game begins long after the apocalypse has already won. To understand the sheer terror of this game, you must understand the event known as the Great Heat. In the lore of Baroque, the world did not end because of a nuclear war. It did not end because a meteor hit the planet from outer space. It ended because the very rules of reality were bent and broken. On a warm May afternoon, a blinding flash of white light consumed the globe. This light did not simply burn away buildings and forests. It melted the boundaries between the physical world and the human mind. The physical laws of nature ceased to function in an instant. Matter became fluid, and thoughts became physical things. This cataclysm left the planet trapped in a permanent state of surreal decay. When you press start on the controller, you do not get an explanation. You simply wake up in a desert of grey ash under a heavy, crimson sky. The visual presentation of the original version maximizes this feeling of total isolation. Unlike the later remakes, the original game uses a strict first-person perspective. You see this broken world entirely through the eyes of the nameless main character. The Sega Saturn hardware struggled to render large 3D environments at the time. The developers turned this technical limitation into a brilliant artistic tool. They covered the entire world in a thick, dark, suffocating fog. You can only see a few feet in front of your face at any moment. The walls and floors are covered in heavily pixelated, dithered textures. These textures seem to warp and twist as you move around them. It creates a sickening visual effect that makes the environment feel unstable. The world looks as though it is actively rotting right before your eyes. You quickly realize you are not entirely alone in this wasteland, which makes things worse. A few surviving beings wander the outskirts of the massive structure known as the Neuro Tower. These are not normal humans, nor are they typical fantasy monsters. They are tragic, distorted entities that represent the absolute lowest point of human existence. You meet a man who wears a massive wooden coffin strapped tightly to his back. He is known simply as the Coffin Man. He spends his days digging graves in the ash for people who cannot die. He speaks in a tired, raspy voice that sounds completely drained of hope. Nearby, you find a young girl with strange organic horns growing from her head. She cannot speak her own thoughts to you. She can only mimic the words and sentences that other people have said before. There is also a creature with a neck that stretches into the sky like a rubber band. His neck grows longer because he is weighed down by his own internal delusions. None of these characters give you a warm welcome or a helpful tutorial. They look at you with a mixture of pity, anger, and absolute despair. They remind you that you are the one who caused this mess. You carry a massive, unnameable sin inside your soul. You are given a weapon called the Angelic Rifle, but it offers little comfort. The weapon looks like a bizarre piece of medical equipment rather than a tool of justice. You are told that your only goal is to heal the world. To do this, you must enter the Neuro Tower and reach the absolute lowest floor. The mechanics of this journey immediately break all the traditional rules of role-playing games. In most games of the era, dying meant losing your progress. Death was a punishment that forced you to reload an old save file. In Baroque, death is an absolute necessity to move the narrative forward. The game is designed as a harsh, unforgiving roguelike. Every single time you enter the Neuro Tower, the layout of the floors changes completely. The rooms move around, the items spawn in different places, and the monsters reset. If you run out of health points, you do not see a standard game over screen. Your character simply collapses into dust, and you wake up back in the ash desert. This loop creates a profound sense of psychological dread for the player. You begin to realize that you are trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. Each life you live is short, brutal, and filled with panic. When you die, you lose all the weapons and items you collected. You are stripped of your power and forced to start over from nothing. Yet, every death slightly alters the dialogue of the characters outside. The Coffin Man might say something new about your past. The Horned Girl might repeat a line that hints at the true nature of the tower. The world changes based on your failures, forcing you to embrace death as progress. It is a brilliant narrative design that perfectly matches the themes of the story. You cannot save this world through a heroic victory. You can only learn about its tragedy by suffering through it over and over again. The game also forces you to manage 2 different resource meters while exploring. You have a standard health bar that drains when monsters hit you. But you also have a vital energy bar that constantly ticks down with every step. If your vital energy hits 0, your health bar begins to rapidly drain away. The tower is literally starving you to death as you walk through its corridors. To survive, you must consume strange items found on the cold metal floors. You find flesh hearts, strange fluids, and glowing bones. The game does not tell you what these items do until you eat them. Eating a random piece of meat might heal your wounds completely. It could also poison your blood, blind your vision, or make you hallucinate. This design choice removes any sense of safety from the gameplay experience. Every single item consumption is a desperate gamble with your own survival. The atmosphere is further heightened by the complete lack of traditional video game music. The soundtrack was composed by Masaharu Iwata, who is famous for his dramatic orchestral scores. For Baroque, however, he abandoned traditional melody entirely. He created a soundscape filled with cold industrial noise and metallic clangs. You hear the distant sound of heavy machinery groaning under immense pressure. You hear low, electronic hums that vibrate through your television speakers. Sometimes the sound drops out completely, leaving you in absolute silence. The only thing you can hear is the heavy, rhythmic thud of your own footsteps. This audio design makes the player feel completely claustrophobic. It feels like the tower itself is a massive machine, and you are trapped inside its gears. This first-person experience on the Sega Saturn remains a masterclass in atmospheric horror. It shows how developers could use hardware limitations to build a specific mood. The low-resolution graphics do not look outdated. Instead, they look forbidden. The game feels like a cursed videotape that you found in an old abandoned house. It does not want to entertain you with flashy graphics or explosive action. It wants to slow your heart rate down with a cold, creeping sense of hopelessness. As you stand in the ash desert during that first hour, looking up at the tower, you feel incredibly small. You know that nothing good is waiting for you inside those metallic walls. You know that you will die dozens of times before you ever find an answer. Yet, the mystery of your own sin draws you forward into the dark. You take a deep breath, step through the fleshy entrance, and let the tower swallow you whole. Chapter 2. Architecture of the Neuro Tower. The Neuro Tower is the dark heart of this entire apocalyptic world. It stands as a massive monument of rusted iron and pulsing flesh. When you look at it from the desert, it pierces the red sky. When you step inside, the entire reality of the game changes completely. The open space of the ash desert vanishes in an instant. You are suddenly trapped inside a narrow, vertical maze that feels entirely alive. The walls are not made of simple brick or stone blocks. They are made of cold metal plates that seem to sweat cold water. Between the plates, you can see thick, dark cables and purple veins. These veins throb with a slow, sickening rhythm as you watch them. The tower is not just a building where monsters live. It is a massive, living machine that is actively digesting the main character. To understand why this environment feels so deeply unsettling, we must look at hardware. The original version of the game was built specifically for the Sega Saturn console. The Saturn was a unique and incredibly complex piece of hardware for its time. It did not render three-dimensional graphics the same way the PlayStation did. The PlayStation used three-sided triangles to build its virtual worlds and characters. The Sega Saturn used four-sided shapes called quadrilaterals to create three-dimensional objects. This technical difference created a very specific visual look for early polygon games. When textures were stretched over these four-sided shapes, they often warped and twisted. If you walked close to a wall, the pixels would distort violently. Most developers fought against this hardware limitation to make games look smooth. The creators of Baroque did the exact opposite. They used this natural distortion to make the tower feel deeply unstable. When you walk down a hallway, the walls seem to swim and bend. The pixelated patterns on the metal floors shift as your perspective changes. It looks like the architecture itself is constantly trying to reshape itself. This visual warping creates a subtle, continuous sense of motion sickness for the player. You never feel like you are standing on solid, dependable ground. The textures are dark, muddy, and filled with heavy visual dithering. Dithering was a technique used to simulate extra colors on limited hardware. It created a checkerboard pattern of pixels that blurred together on old televisions. On a modern screen, this pattern looks like a layer of static fuzz. This fuzz covers every surface of the Neuro Tower like a digital fungus. It makes the world look dirty, forbidden, and completely decayed. The perspective of the game amplifies this technical ugliness into pure psychological horror. The developers chose a strict first-person point of view for the original release. You do not see your character running around the screen from behind. You look directly through his eyes into the dark, narrow corridors. This choice connects the player directly to the claustrophobia of the maze. In 1998, first-person movement in console games was still relatively rare and clumsy. The movement in Baroque is slow, heavy, and deliberate. Turning your head takes a moment, forcing you to commit to your gaze. When you walk, the camera bobs up and down with a rhythmic thud. This camera movement simulates the physical weight of a tired, guilty body. You can feel the exhaustion of the character through the controller itself. This tight perspective is made even more terrifying by the rendering fog. The Sega Saturn could not draw large open spaces without slowing down. To keep the game running smoothly, the developers used a thick fog wall. This fog is not a soft white mist like in Silent Hill. It is a heavy, pitch-black void that starts just a few feet away. You can only ever see the immediate area around your character's body. Every time you walk forward, the hallway literally creates itself out of the blackness. When you turn around, the world you just walked through vanishes back into nothing. You are completely trapped in a tiny bubble of visible space at all times. You can never look ahead to plan your route through the floor. You can only react to whatever monsters emerge from the dark void. The layout of these corridors changes every single time you enter the tower. This feature is a core part of the game's brutal roguelike design. In the late 90s, randomized level design was mostly used in computer games. Bringing this mechanic to a 3D console horror game was a massive risk. The game uses a complex code to stitch random rooms together with hallways. One layout might give you long, straight hallways with empty dead ends. The next layout might pack rooms tightly together like a giant honeycomb. This randomness strips away the comfort of memory from the player. In other horror games, you can memorize where the monsters hide. You can learn the fastest path to the next safe room. In the Neuro Tower, your past knowledge is completely useless. Every single floor is a brand new maze that you have never seen. This architectural chaos creates a powerful sense of total geographical disorientation. You have access to a mini-map that tracks your movements across the floor. This map appears as simple, glowing lines in the corner of your screen. It does not show you the whole floor when you arrive. It only draws the lines as you physically walk through the spaces. If you get into a hectic fight, you might spin around multiple times. When the fight ends, you will have no idea which direction you came from. You are forced to constantly look down at the abstract map lines to survive. The map becomes a vital crutch, but it also distracts your eyes. You find yourself staring at blue lines instead of watching the dark hallways. This distraction is exactly when the tower decides to strike at you. The sensory design of the tower is deeply tied to its soundscape. Masaharu Iwata designed the audio to be an active source of player discomfort. He completely avoided using catchy melodies or traditional musical instruments for the exploration. Instead, he filled the space with a terrifying wall of industrial noise. As you walk, you hear the deep groan of heavy metal bending. You hear the sharp hiss of high-pressure steam escaping from hidden pipes. There are distant clangs that sound like giant iron hammers hitting anvils. These noises do not follow a predictable loop or regular musical rhythm. They trigger randomly as you explore the randomized floors of the tower. This randomness keeps your ears on high alert for the entire journey. You can never get used to the background noise because it changes. The silence of the tower is often even worse than the loud machinery. Sometimes all the industrial noise will suddenly drop out for a few minutes. The only sound left in the game is the wet crunch of footsteps. You hear your boots pressing down on the cold, damp metal grates. You can hear the low, wet squish of organic material under your feet. This contrast reminds you that the tower is half machine and half animal. It makes you feel like you're walking across a giant tongue. The audio design strips away any sense of heroic detachment from the action. You are not a cool warrior exploring an exciting fantasy dungeon. You are an uninvited germ crawling through the inside of a diseased god. As you descend deeper into the tower, the architecture undergoes a tragic transformation. The upper floors look like an abandoned underground manufacturing facility. Everything is iron, pipes, valves, and cold, grey metal flooring. It feels artificial, mechanical, and completely devoid of any human life or warmth. But as you find the portals to lower floors, the metal disappears. The walls start to look like giant sheets of burnt red skin. The metal pipes are replaced by thick, pulsing bundles of exposed muscle. The doorways look like giant, toothless mouths that you must step through. The tower is literally shedding its mechanical skin to reveal its true form. It becomes a meat maze that is wet, warm, and deeply disgusting. This visual shift tells a story without using any words or dialogue. It shows that the great heat melted everything together into a single mass. The technology of humanity and the flesh of humanity have become one thing. The lower you go, the closer you get to the source. The architecture becomes more chaotic, more emotional, and more terrifyingly organic. By the time you reach the bottom, the concept of a building is gone. You are simply wandering through a labyrinth of pure, screaming subconscious thought. The gameplay mechanics of the vital meter turn this architecture into a trap. Your vital energy is constantly draining away with every single second that passes. This means the layout of the tower is your greatest economic enemy. A long, winding hallway that leads to a dead end is a disaster. It wastes your precious energy points for absolutely no reward or items. The random design is actively trying to trick you into wasting steps. You want to explore carefully to find helpful weapons and protective brands. However, if you explore too slowly, you will starve to death in the dark. The game forces you into a state of constant, panicked movement. You must sprint through these warped, pixelated hallways as fast as possible. You cannot stop to think, breathe, or process the horror around you. The architecture demands your absolute speed, or it demands your immediate death. Every single element of the Neuro Tower is designed to crush your spirit. The technical glitches of the Sega Saturn create a world that looks broken. The first-person view traps you inside a tiny, suffocating pocket of vision. The randomized layouts ensure that you are always lost and always afraid. The industrial soundtrack fills your ears with the sounds of a dying factory. It is an extraordinary example of matching level design with thematic intent. The tower is a physical manifestation of guilt, confusion, and cosmic punishment. It is a space designed to be suffered through, not conquered or won. You crawl through its metallic veins because you have no other choice. You let its halls warp your mind because death is your only map. Chapter 3. The Flesh Made Distorted. Look closely at the strange creatures crawling through the dark metal corridors of the tower. These enemies are known officially as grotesques. They do not look like the monsters found in other horror video games. They do not want to scare you with sharp teeth or sudden jump scares. Instead, they want to show you the deep agony of their own twisted existence. Every single monster was once a living, breathing human being before the apocalypse. The burning white light of the great heat melted their bodies and minds together. It turned their deepest secrets and darkest desires into physical, bleeding flesh. To understand why these designs feel so deeply wrong, we must look at development. The development team at Sting hired an artist named Kenjiro Takeya to build these nightmares. Takeya did not just draw two-dimensional concept art on a piece of white paper. He physically sculpted every single monster using real clay and resin models in his workshop. The developers then took digital photos of these real clay statues from multiple angles. They converted these physical textures into digital polygons for the Sega Saturn hardware system. This design choice gives the monsters an incredibly eerie, stop-motion look when moving. They look like cursed puppets that have been brought to life by dark magic. Their skin has a rough, chalky texture that catches the virtual dungeon light poorly. They do not move with the smooth animations of traditional video game enemies. They twitch, shake, and hobble forward with agonizing pain in every step they take. The word Baroque itself means something that is irregular, misshapen, or deeply distorted. In the lore of the game, a Baroque is a mental fixation or obsession. Everyone in this world held onto a secret delusion before the white light hit. When the world melted, those mental fixations became the literal blueprints for their new bodies. If a person was obsessed with hiding away, their body became a shell. If a person felt deep guilt, their flesh turned inside out to expose bone. Their physical forms became perfect, terrifying mirrors of their internal psychological brokenness. They are not evil creatures trying to conquer the world for a dark master. They are simply people who are trapped inside the physical shape of their sins. Consider the common enemy known as the Gliro, which players encounter very early. This creature looks like a strange reddish doll with 4 independent arms and no legs. Instead of feet, its lower body curls into a single, spring-like rubber tail. It hops toward the player with a disturbing, rhythmic bouncing sound down the halls. The Gliro is a physical manifestation of absolute greed and the desire to possess things. Its multiple hands constantly reach out into the black fog, searching for something to hold. It does not actually want to hurt your character out of pure malicious hatred. It simply wants to steal the items right out of your active inventory bags. If it successfully grabs a sword or a healing item, it turns around instantly. It will hop away back into the darkness, cradling the stolen object like a baby. It is a sad creature, trapped forever by its own need to hoard trash. Another deeply unsettling creature that haunts the middle floors is called Nykel and Nika. This entity appears as a giant, floating mass of pale skin and exposed bone. When you look closely, you see 2 distinct human faces growing from the top. These faces are attached to a single bloated body wrapped tightly in thick tubes. It drifts slowly through the narrow hallways like a bloated, biological hot air balloon. This monster represents the absolute terror of codependency and the fear of being left alone. The 2 minds are fused together forever, but they cannot truly communicate or connect. They scream in a bizarre, jewel-toned pitch whenever you step into their immediate sight. They attack by swinging their heavy, bound lower body toward your face like a pendulum. They cannot exist without each other, yet their fusion is a source of endless agony. The tragedy deepens when you learn about the history of the legendary Malkuth Order. This group was a religious organization that ruled over society before the world broke. They wore bright red ceremonial cloaks and heavy metal gas masks to hide their faces. They claimed they were working to protect the Word of God from human corruption. They built the Neuro Tower as a giant laboratory to conduct their holy experiments. They wanted to fix the flaws of humanity by connecting directly with the Creator. However, Their pride and arrogance caused them to misread the holy signals completely. They ended up triggering the Great Heat themselves, destroying the world they wanted to save. When the apocalypse happened, the members of the Malkuth Order did not escape the mutation. Their punishment was far worse because they believed they were superior to normal humans. The high-ranking priests were transformed into creatures known as the terrifying false angels. These enemies guard the lower, more organic floors of the shifting Neuro Tower. They still wear the tattered remnants of their red robes over their bodies. However, their flesh has fused completely with their mechanical armor and weapons. Their faces are blank, metallic plates with no eyes or mouths to speak. They float through the meat-walled rooms like mechanical ghosts of a forgotten church. They believe they are still performing a holy duty by killing the player character. They do not realize that they are just broken monsters serving a dead dream. The game handles combat with these creatures in a very specific, deliberate way. You do not gain experience points in Baroque by slaughtering enemies like in Final Fantasy. Killing a grotesque does not make your character stronger or increase your health bar. Instead, the game uses a unique system called purification to handle enemy deaths. When you strike down a monster with your sword, it does not just die. It bursts into a bright flash of white light, leaving a small item behind. The game text tells you that you have purified the creature's distorted soul. You are essentially releasing them from the physical prison of their own dark delusions. This mechanic shifts the entire emotional tone of the combat loops for players. You are not a proud hero clearing out an evil dungeon full of monsters. You are a grim executioner delivering mercy to people who are too broken to save themselves. The early Western gaming community built a massive mythology around these monster designs in 1999. Because the game was only released in Japan on Saturn, information was very scarce. Young players on early internet web forums had to rely on low-resolution screenshots. They translated the Japanese names using basic tools, creating strange, poetic titles for enemies. A rumor spread that some grotesques were actually based on real historical figures from war. Players claimed that if you stood still, certain enemies would weep instead of attacking. This rumor was eventually debunked by fans who looked directly into the game code. However, the myth highlighted how deeply the game's atmosphere affected the human imagination. The monsters felt so human that players naturally looked for real human tragedy inside them. There is also a dark, technical rumor regarding the audio files of the grotesques. Internet users claimed that the developers mixed real humans screaming into the industrial sound effects. They believed the game disc contained hidden audio tracks of people in actual pain. This urban legend added a layer of forbidden terror to the Sega Saturn CD. In reality, the sound designers used early digital synthesizers to create the audio. They warped traditional animal noises and metal groans to sound like human vocal cords. They wanted to create an auditory illusion that tricked the brain into hearing voices. This technical trick was incredibly successful at creating a deep sense of ambient dread. It made players feel like the walls were crying out in pain during gameplay. The design of the grotesques also reflects a sharp critique of modern human society. Each monster represents a normal human emotion or vice taken to its absolute extreme. The game suggests that all people carry a hidden Baroque inside their minds. We all have obsessions, fears, and secret desires that we hide from others. The Great Heat simply removed the polite masks that we wear in public spaces. It forced humanity to look at its true distorted face without any filters. This thematic lens makes the exploration of the tower feel deeply personal and uncomfortable. As you fight through the floors, you are not just exploring a fantasy world, you are walking through a graveyard of human psychology, looking at broken pieces of ourselves. The gameplay loop forces you to interact with these tragedies constantly to stay alive. You must hunt down these mutated humans because their bodies contain the items you need. To survive the dropping vital bar, you must consume the flesh they leave behind. This creates a deeply uncomfortable, parasitic relationship between the protagonist and the monster population. You are literally maintaining your own life by devouring the remnants of their suffering. The game does not allow you to maintain a clean, heroic sense of morality. It drags you down into the dirt and flesh alongside the things you fight. You become a monster yourself, driven by a desperate animal need to survive the night. As you step into the deeper levels, the grotesques become larger and more abstract. They stop looking like mutated humans and begin to look like giant geometric shapes of meat. You encounter creatures that are simply giant, rolling wheels of teeth and blind eyes. Others are massive pillars of flesh that slam down from the dark ceiling without warning. The human identity has been completely crushed by the weight of the tower's depth. They have been looping in this digital hell for so long that they forgot their names. They forgot what it felt like to stand under a normal blue sky with friends. They are just raw, pulsing nodes of pure agony waiting for your blade to strike. This processing of pain is what makes Baroque a true masterpiece of psychological horror design. It understands that the scariest monsters are the ones that remind us of our vulnerabilities. The clay-sculpted models of Kenjiro Takeya created an unforgettable visual legacy that stands alone today. They look ancient, clunky, and deeply cursed on the Sega Saturn's limited visual hardware display. They move with a terrifying purpose, dragging their heavy, mutated limbs across the rust floors. When you purify them, you feel a brief moment of relief mixed with profound sadness. You know that in the next loop, they will be right back in the dark. They are trapped in the machine forever, and you are trapped right there with them. Chapter 4. The Sins of the Archangel. Every tragic story needs a driving force that sets the misery into motion. In the broken world of Baroque, that force is a figure known as the Archangel. When you first wake up in the ash desert, he is the very first entity you see. He stands near the entrance of the pulsing Neuro Tower like a shining monument. He possesses massive, pale wings that look elegant but completely artificial upon closer. His voice is calm, clear, and carries a strange mechanical authority that demands your immediate attention. In a wasteland filled with screaming monsters and sobbing survivors, he feels like your only anchor. He looks directly into your empty eyes and tells you exactly what you want to hear. He tells you that you have a purpose in this dead world. He claims that your terrible sins caused the great heat to destroy everything. Then, he offers you a simple, elegant path toward absolute redemption. The Archangel explains that you must carry the angelic rifle to the bottom floor. He tells you that the absolute God is trapped deep inside the lower meat maze. According to his words, the God has become sick and distorted by human delusions. Your job is to use the weapon to purify the God and fix reality. For a player lost in a confusing roguelike game, this direction feels incredibly comforting. You naturally want to trust the only person who treats you like a human being. You take the rifle, step into the dark fog, and begin your descent. This dynamic creates a powerful psychological trap for both the character and the player. You willingly become a tool for an authority figure because you feel too guilty to question him. However, As you die and return to life, the pristine illusion begins to crack. You start to notice strange details in the Archangel's behavior across different life loops. If you return to him after a successful run, his reactions are not genuinely joyful. He often sounds frustrated, annoyed, or deeply impatient that the world has not reset correctly. His dialogue shifts slightly based on the specific items you bring out of the tower. If you manage to find a hidden text file, his calm tone completely vanishes. He snaps at you with a cold, robotic anger that reveals his true nature. You realize that he does not want to save you from your crushing guilt. He is simply using your amnesia to control your movements inside the shifting maze. The true history of the Archangel is a story of ultimate pride and catastrophic failure. Before the light hit, he was the absolute leader of the powerful Malkuth order. He was a brilliant scientist who became obsessed with the concept of human perfection. He believed that the human mind was too weak and dirty to exist safely. To fix this problem, he designed the Neuro Tower as a massive laboratory. He wanted to use the tower to bridge the gap between humanity and God. He believed he could create a perfect, unified consciousness that would eliminate all sadness. His intentions were not evil when he started his grand scientific project. He truly believed he was chosen to lead the world into a glorious new era. The disaster occurred because the Archangel refused to accept the limitations of his own creation. He tried to force the absolute God into a machine of metal and glass. This action caused the God to panic and release the blinding white light. The great heat was not an act of divine anger against a sinful world. It was a massive, desperate defense mechanism triggered by a trapped, terrified deity. The Archangel's holy experiment completely backfired, melting reality into a permanent, screaming nightmare. Instead of admitting his mistake, the Archangel chose to double down on his grand delusion. He refused to let the world die, and he refused to let it heal. He created the narrative loops to keep himself in control of the wreckage. The nameless protagonist you control is not a random sinner who survived the blast. You are actually a physical clone created from the Archangel's own living flesh. He used his advanced technology to strip away your voice and your memories. He left you with a heavy, artificial sense of guilt that does not belong to you. He literally built you to be a disposable organic robot that could do his dirty work. He cannot enter the deepest floors of the tower because his energy is too unstable. He needs a blank slate to carry the angelic rifle into the core. Every time you walk down those hallways, you are carrying the physical embodiment of his arrogance. You are fighting through a nightmare that your creator built with his own hands. The hidden mechanics of the Idea Sephiroths reveal the true horror of his plan. These items look like glowing crystal shards that drop from purified monsters during exploration. The Archangel tells you that these crystals are fragments of holy energy that must be saved. In reality, these shards are the crystallized remains of real human souls and thoughts. The Archangel wants you to collect them so he can feed them to the machine. He is trying to patch the holes in his broken reality by using human pain. If you obey his commands, you are just helping him maintain a beautiful, permanent prison. You are keeping the survivors trapped in an endless loop of mutation and regular death. When you finally reach the absolute bottom floor, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. You do not find an evil demon waiting to destroy the world in a final battle. You find the absolute God appearing as a massive, weeping entity wrapped in metal. The God is not attacking anyone. It is simply reacting to the pain of the world. The Archangel arrives through a projection and orders you to fire the angelic rifle immediately. If you pull the trigger, the screen fades to a beautiful, clean white light. The game ends, the music swells, and you feel a brief moment of cinematic accomplishment. Then, the game cuts directly back to the title screen without showing a single credit. When you hit start again, you wake up right back in the grey ash desert. The Archangel is standing in the exact same spot with his artificial wings. He greets you with the exact same dialogue he used during your first hour. The world did not heal, and the sins were not washed away by the light. The rifle did not purify the god, it simply reset the experimental parameters. You realize that the entire game is a cruel joke played on your character. The Archangel is using you to run a continuous series of failed laboratory tests. He is trapped in his own Baroque, which is the need to be right. He will keep resetting the universe forever until his calculations produce a perfect outcome. During the late 90s, this specific narrative twist caused a massive stir online. The game was highly obscure outside of Japan, leading to incredible rumors on web forums. Early players did not have access to complete fan translations or detailed strategy guides. They had to piece the story together by looking at grainy images and text. A major conspiracy theory emerged regarding the Archangel's design on the Sega Saturn. Fans noticed that his shadow on the ground did not match his physical body. His character sprite showed beautiful wings, but his shadow looked like a giant crab. This detail led to a massive wave of early internet urban legends and creepypastas. Players claimed that the Archangel was actually a giant parasitic insect that fed on human thoughts. They believed his angelic form was just an illusion generated by the tower's magnetic field. Some users claimed that if you stood still for hours, his disguise would drop. They wrote long, detailed text guides explaining how to trigger his true monster form. This rumor became so popular that it completely dominated early English discussions of the game. When data miners finally examined the Saturn disk files years later, they found nothing. The strange shadow was simply a technical rendering glitch caused by the Saturn's geometry. The console struggled to project complex shadows over the warped, dithered floor textures. However, the myth perfectly illustrated how much the game's atmosphere infected the human mind. The player base naturally assumed that everything about the Archangel was a lie. Another popular myth claimed that you could completely break the loop by killing him early. Players spread rumors about a hidden button combination that allowed you to attack him in the desert. They claimed that if you shot him with the rifle immediately, a secret ending would trigger. This ending supposedly showed the main character walking away into a real green world. Young gamers spent countless hours trying to trigger this execution out of pure frustration. They wanted so badly to punish the entity that had lied to them for weeks. This rumor was also completely false, as the desert area disables all weapon usage. The game mechanics strictly prevent you from harming your creator outside the tower walls. You are forced to endure his presence every time you fail a run. This narrative structure serves as a brilliant commentary on the nature of video games. In most games, players blindly follow the directions given by the text boxes. You kill the targets, collect the gold, and trust that the game is fair. Baroque uses the Archangel to weaponize this natural gamer obedience against your own self. He represents the voice of the developer, telling you how to play the game. By following his instructions, you are actively choosing to prolong the nightmare of the world. The game forces you to realize that blindly obeying orders is a sin. To find the true path, you must learn to reject his guidance. You must stop using the weapon he gave you to clear the floors. To break the cycle, you have to change how you interact with the world. You must stop looking at the grotesques as enemies that need to be cleared out. You have to start listening to the strange clues dropped by the wasteland survivors. The Coffin Man and the Horned Girl know more about the truth than the Archangel. They tell you that fusion, not destruction, is the only way to heal. You must learn to throw the idea Sephiroths directly into the god instead of shooting. This choice requires the player to completely unlearn everything the game taught them. You have to embrace the chaotic distortion instead of trying to fix it with violence. This realization turns the final hours of the game into a deeply emotional experience. Every time you pass the Archangel in the desert, his words lose their power. You see him not as a terrifying god, but as a pathetic, broken scientist. He is a man who destroyed the planet because he was afraid of human flaws. He is trapped in a prison of his own design, unable to move forward. His wings are pale, his church is rusted, and his plan is a failure. You step past him into the fog, ready to end his grand experiment. You go down into the meat maze, not to save your soul, but to free it. Chapter 5. The Legacy of a Broken World. The immediate release of Baroque did not trigger a massive cultural explosion. The game arrived quietly on Japanese store shelves during the final years of the Sega Saturn. Most mainstream gaming magazines at the time did not know how to handle its strange design. It did not fit cleanly into the popular survival horror templates of Resident Evil. It was far too dark and cryptic for traditional role-playing game fans to easily enjoy. The game sold poorly during its initial run, leaving it buried under more popular releases. It seemed destined to become a completely forgotten footnote in the massive history of gaming. Yet, a dedicated circle of players refused to let the flashing white light fade away. Those who spent hours inside the Neuro Tower recognized that something special had been built. They began talking about the deep story on early Japanese web forums and school playgrounds. They shared secret strategies for survival and debated the true identity of the nameless main character. This slow, organic word-of-mouth campaign saved the game from total historical erasure. The development team at Sting noticed this passionate, growing fanbase and decided to keep going. They realized that the world they created had far more stories left to tell. This realization began a long, strange journey of ports, spin-offs, and complete visual reinventions. The first major shift occurred just 1 year later, during the summer of 1999. Sting ported the game to the massively popular Sony PlayStation under a new title. This version was called Baroque Special, and it tried to fix several technical problems. The PlayStation hardware handled three-dimensional graphics very differently than the complex Sega Saturn system. The developers had to rebuild the entire visual framework of the game from scratch. This port added a variety of brand new items, extra cutscenes, and minor gameplay adjustments. It also introduced a special menu that let players view the unlocked narrative cutscenes. This feature helped fans piece together the fractured timelines of the story much more easily. The PlayStation version reached a much wider audience than the original Sega Saturn release. It solidified the game's growing status as an underground avant-garde classic of psychological horror. The success of this port allowed the creators to take an even bigger creative risk. In the year 2000, they released a bizarre prequel game called Baroque Syndrome. This game completely abandoned the action-packed roguelike gameplay of the original Shifting Tower journey. Instead, it was designed entirely as a text-heavy, psychological visual novel for players. It explored the chaotic days leading right up to the catastrophic Great Heat event. Baroque syndrome focused heavily on the normal citizens living under the Malkuth Order's rule. It showed how human society slowly broke down before the physical universe actually melted. The story followed a young investigator looking into a wave of bizarre psychological delusions. Players watched as normal people grew deeply obsessed with their personal, internal Baroque fixations. The visual novel used clean, highly disturbing artwork to show the early mutations of flesh. This spin-off provided vital context for the heavy atmosphere of the original masterpiece. It proved that the true horror of the universe was rooted in human psychology. For nearly 7 years, the franchise remained a dark secret hidden away in Japan. Western gamers could only read about the Bleeding Tower through translated fan web pages. That status changed dramatically in 2007 when a complete remake was officially announced. This new version was developed for the PlayStation 2 and later the Nintendo Wii. It was published in North America by Atlas, bringing the story west for the first time. This remake was not a simple graphical upgrade of the old 1998 files. It was a complete, top-to-bottom reimagining of how the game functioned and looked. The most radical change in the 2007 remake was the complete removal of perspective. The developers completely abandoned the tight, claustrophobic first-person view of the original Saturn game. They replaced it with a standard, over-the-shoulder third-person action camera system for players. The nameless protagonist was no longer an invisible vessel for the player's direct eyesight. He was given a visible, detailed character model with a sleek anime design aesthetic. He ran through brightly lit rooms, swinging his sword with flashy, fast-paced animations. The slow, heavy weight of the original movement system was completely gone now. This change in camera perspective completely altered the psychological impact of the digital environment. In 1998, the pitch-black fog forced you to look closely at every surface. The 2007 remake utilized the extra processing power to render entire rooms at once. The thick, terrifying void was replaced by clean, open corridors and visible enemy layouts. Players could easily look across a room to see exactly where monsters were hiding. This extra vision removed the creeping sense of claustrophobia that defined the original experience. The game transformed from a terrifying psychological nightmare into a standard dungeon-crawling action game. The iconic soundtrack also underwent a massive and controversial transformation for the modern remake. The cold, industrial noise and metallic clangs of Masaharu Iwata were completely removed. The developers hired new composers to create a high-energy, heavy metal guitar soundtrack. When you entered a room full of grotesques, loud electric guitars would instantly blast out. This audio choice completely changed how players felt about fighting mutated human beings. It was no longer a grim, sad act of delivering mercy through painful purification. It felt like a standard anime battle where you defeat monsters to feel powerful. The deep, mourning sadness of the dead world was buried under loud musical energy. The visual style lost its forbidden, cursed quality in the transition to higher resolutions. The physical clay models of Kenjiro Takeya were converted into smooth, clean digital polygons. On the PlayStation 2, the grotesques looked like standard, polished video game enemies. They lost the rough, chalky texture that made them look like real, cursed puppets. The colors were brighter, the lines were cleaner, and the textures no longer warped violently. The technical limitations that made the Saturn version look like a rotting artifact were gone. To many purists, the remake felt far too clean to be truly Baroque. Despite these massive creative shifts, the remake still preserved the incredible underlying narrative structure. Western players were finally able to experience the brilliant, looping tragedy of the Archangel's deception. They discovered how refreshing it felt to play a game where death meant progress. The localization by Atlas featured excellent English voice acting that captured the broken characters perfectly. The tired voice of the Coffin Man sounded appropriately drained of any real hope. The game received mixed reviews from major Western critics who found it too repetitive. However, it quickly built a dedicated cult following in America and Europe anyway. Looking back from the modern landscape, Baroque was decades ahead of its time. The gaming industry in the 90s was completely obsessed with linear cinematic storytelling loops. Games wanted to be like Hollywood movies, with clear beginnings, middles, and definitive ends. Sting built a game that completely rejected that entire philosophy of traditional entertainment. They understood that video games could use repetition to create deep psychological meaning. They forced players to find comfort in failure long before the industry embraced it. The mechanical bones of this obscure game would eventually become the future of gaming. Consider the massive explosion of the modern roguelike genre over the last decade. Games like Hades and Returnal have won major awards for their narrative design choices. These modern titles are celebrated for weaving their stories directly into player deaths. When you die in Hades, you unlock new dialogue options with your family. This exact narrative engine was running on the Sega Saturn back in 1998. Baroque did not use randomness just to make the gameplay last longer for players. It used the changing tower layouts to simulate the feeling of mental confusion. It proved that game mechanics could mirror the internal psychological state of a character. The legendary Dark Souls series also shares a massive amount of creative DNA with Baroque. Both games drop the player into a silent, ruined world after the apocalypse. Both games refuse to explain the lore through long, traditional cinematic cutscenes. Instead, they force the player to piece the story together using item descriptions. You must look closely at the brands, the swords, and the broken items. Both universes feature tragic NPCs who are slowly losing their minds to internal delusions. The grim, uncompromised atmosphere of Lordran feels deeply connected to the grey ash desert. It is a shared philosophy of trusting the player to explore the darkness alone. This historical connection is why the original version remains so highly revered today. It stands as a brilliant monument to a specific era of experimental game design. Developers in the late 90s were still figuring out how 3D spaces worked. They were willing to take massive artistic risks that modern corporate studios avoid. They built worlds that were intentionally ugly, uncomfortable, and deeply confusing to experience. This willingness to offend the player's senses is what makes the Saturn version art. It does not care if you like it, it only cares that you feel it. The preservation of this classic game has become a major focus for retro historians. For decades, the superior Sega Saturn version was completely unplayable for English speakers. The heavy reliance on text menus and item names made importing it very difficult. That barrier was finally shattered by a dedicated community fan translation project years later. A team of brilliant hackers and writers spent months translating the original game code. They finally allowed the Western world to experience the suffocating first-person fog in English. This project revived interest in the title, sparking new video essays and retrospective articles. When you boot up that fan-translated Saturn file today, the magic is still there. The static fuzz of the dithered textures still looks like a digital disease on screen. The groaning metal of the industrial soundscape still sends shivers down your spine. You still feel that heavy pit of simulated guilt when looking up at the tower. It remains a masterclass in building a cohesive, uncompromising artistic vision from limited hardware. The game does not feel old. It feels like an ancient, forbidden secret. It is a beautiful, bleeding relic from an era when horror was truly experimental. The tragedy of the blaze in Baroque is ultimately a story about human resilience. The characters are trapped in a permanent loop of physical and mental mutation. The world is dead, the sky is bleeding, and their god is weeping. Yet, despite the endless loops of failure, the main character keeps stepping forward. He keeps entering the breathing tower, ready to die for a chance at truth. The game asks us to look closely at our own internal Baroque fixations. It asks if we have the courage to face our deepest, ugliest distortions. As the screen fades to black once more, the rust continues to whisper its secrets.